So what we're calling the first shock of existence is the experience of the dawn human being, the early human of death. But I actually confront my own death. And I've promised that we're going to spend through the summer several weeks talking about death, which is unbelievably important. There's been all this talk of dying during the corona pandemic that we're in the middle of, which is now at its height around the world. There's been no talk about death. What is the experience of death? What happens after death, right? The great traditions overreached and described what they didn't know, but dogmatic materialism underreaches. We actually know there's a continuity of consciousness after death. How do we know that? So we're going to actually open up this conversation in a deep, big way in our first principles section, 11 to 12, but we're not there yet. So let's just find first shock, the first shock of existence. Dawn man confronts death. Then we go through all the levels of consciousness, all the developmental levels of the human being, right? And we go stage to stage. You know that it's only 5,000 years ago that writing began? How many people knew that? Writing is only 5,000 years old. We go through, there's 10,000 generations of human beings, and each one, right, adds, right? Each one adds a link to the chain, right? Let's just open up for a second. Right, so we go through all of the technological levels from hunter-gatherer through early farming, horticultural with a handheld instrument, and then to agrarian, drawn by a horse or an oxen of various kind, and then we get ultimately, slowly through different stages of more advanced kinds of farming, right? Goes on for quite a long time till we finally get to early modernity. And we have this explosion in the Renaissance of the principles that birthed the Industrial Revolution. And then we get ultimately to this larger explosion of information revolution, and then, right, biotech and nanotech, and we're now at the dawn of artificial intelligence. That's the technological line of development. But there's also an interior line of development. And in the interior line of development, we move from clans, right, and their interior structures of consciousness, and then we move to the structures of consciousness of kingdoms, right? We move from tribes. Initially we have clans, then we have tribes, and tribes are defined by blood, right? Bloodlines define tribes. Race defines tribes. And then we move beyond race and bloodlines, and beyond the racism implicit in them, and we move to empires, nations. And nations means that tribes are united. It's a great leap in the evolution of love. Does everyone understand that? Right? The Hutus don't kill the Tutsis because we're part of a nation, right? The tribal doesn't become my identification. Does everyone get that? Right now we've got this notion of empire, right? These larger sense of identity. But we also have this new emergence gradually in the Renaissance as the empires expanded. It seeds ultimately what's going to become the Renaissance, which is the emergence of, right, there's actually one world, actually world-centric consciousness. We move from clan-centric to a kind of ethnocentric tribe to a kind of ethnocentric larger empire nation. Each one is more and more expanded ethnocentric circles of intimacy. So now we move towards this emergence of universal human rights, this new understanding of the human being, right? The scientific method, right? This all explodes into reality. For the first time, we can actually extrapolate universals from particulars. It's not just particular nations, which are expanded tribes merged together in a nation, and then each nation says, I'm the best. Each religion says, I'm the best, and I've got to destroy the other ones, right? I mean, that notion of thinking goes on pretty much to World War I. But already in the Renaissance, the seeds of overcoming that are planted. The seeds of universal human rights are planted, right? And although it takes time, it takes till after World War I and then really after World War II to fully move beyond it, but there's the gradual emergence of world-centric intimacy, right? The gradual emergence of a sense of universal human rights, the emergence of the feminine. Slavery is abolished, right? At least so it seems. There's this enormous move forward. Right? There's a League of Nations, there's a United Nations, right? There's these early steps, but they're based on, now let's stay close now, okay? they're based on very limited first principles. So stay close here, guys, okay? Stay close. So what's the interior technology, right, that's moving the world from the Renaissance till, till today, essentially? What's the big momentous leap, right? In this evolutionary story, this new emergence, what's the interior emergence of, stay close, of the Renaissance? Anyone? What's the interior emergence? It's one and it's simple, right? That David, rock on, separate self. What does separate self mean? Now let's do this together. Let's get first principles. We're going to go deep into this first principle because it's everything. It's everything. So the first principle is separate self, meaning I'm not defined by my tribe. I'm not defined by my race. I'm not defined even by my nation, right? There's a notion of individuation, meaning Nathan has irreducible value and dignity as Nathan, right? Individuality. So this is the notion of separate self, and it's the dignity of separate self. I wouldn't quite call it, Joey, I'm going to play with you for a second, not quite self-awareness, because the awareness of a self is much, much earlier, right? It's separate self-awareness. It's the awareness of the dignity of separate self, right? And from the dignity of separate self comes this emergent freedom, because that's the great momentous leap forward. Now, what does it leave behind? So it leaves behind two things. One is it leaves behind in the pre-modern period, one, the realization that the great traditions had of true self. Stay with us. I mean, the great traditions at their most advanced, this wasn't the popular realization. I want you to get that clear. This was the esoteric realization at the leading edges, was this realization that actually I'm one with the field of consciousness. Let's call that true self. Right? The singular, says Erwin Schrödinger, right? The quantum physicist who's describing the true self-realization. He describes it as the knowing of one mind, right? The singular that has no plural, right? The total number of true selves in the world is one, and I'm one with the field of consciousness. So, excuse me, that realization is lost. Stay slow, okay? Separate self emerges with this new dignity, and the pre-modern traditions got lost, right? In other words, they were still there, they were still practiced, they were still at play, but at the center of the leading edge of consciousness, there was the sense that the individual human reason and human rationality, in the sense of reason per se, right, could actually dominate. And the dualism of the 17th century, spirit and matter, matter is dead and inert, spirit's alive, the dualism gave way to materialism. So the top half, the top story of dualism, meaning spirit, got lopped off. God was declared dead because God was caricatured, right, as the God on a throne in the sky who created the world via fiat, the ex machina, right? That God was killed. Right? But people didn't realize that God's actually so much deeper and more than that. People killed a caricature of God. And what we had left was a materialism, right? Meaning dead, inert matter. And we're separate selves. We have dignity, but now we're not quite sure why we have dignity. The dignity started to be contrived, especially as the false neo-Darwinist dogmatic claim was made that we're just a random aggregation of particles, that reality has no purpose or telos, it's not going anywhere. And that to even talk about telos is heresy. Now, again, that's what science became. Now, science was doing something noble. Not that science was bad. Science was doing something incredibly noble and beautiful. Science was trying to liberate the ability to know from the shackles, right, of the great religions that actually told Galileo, this is what you see through your telescope, not what you think you see. So religion actually crushed the endeavor of human knowing outside of the realms of dogma. That was religion's great shadow. At its very leading edge, religion was beautiful, and that developed the consciousness of true self. It developed the consciousness of knowing this oneness with the field of consciousness. But an exoteric public religion crushed knowing. So science wanted to liberate knowing with the scientific method from the shackles, the suffocating horror and cruelties of religion. So science liberates itself right? Out of any connection, science differentiates from spirit, but then that differentiation becomes a dissociation, right? It becomes a complete dissociation from spirit. The separation of the value spheres of, let's say, religion, right, from, let's say, science, from interior morals, that separation became a dissociation. Does everyone get that? Right? We got to understand, we got to get this, okay? So now we have a separate self, but the separate self that began with this innate dignity, this innate assumption that the separate self was part of a larger field, was lost. The separate self became desiccated. The separate self became kind of like a dangling modifier in a sentence of spirit that was erased. Right? So the separate self begins as an adjective and as a verb in a sentence of spirit in a universe. Universe, a sentence of spirit, a verse which was one universe, one love, one heart. And then the separate self became a dignified expression of that. Was a natural intuition, but it was never expressed. It was a given. But then, right, as we started to talk about dualism, we said that material was inert, dead, and only spirit was real, and spirit lived in the human being. But then the vision of spirit God got slaughtered because that vision of spirit God was too connected to pre-modern superstition and, as Voltaire said, cruelties. So we were left with a denuded dualism. We just had its bottom half. What's the bottom half of dualism by itself? Materialism. Does everyone get that? If you knock off the top half of dualism, what do you get? Materialism. That's all you get. Dogmatic materialism, which now dominates science. Science is afraid to say anything else. So what gradually happens is science becomes as dogmatic as the religion that it rebelled against. Does everyone understand that? Very often there's a revolution, and then the revolution becomes more oppressive than those people you're rebelling against. Does everyone get that in politics? Who's getting this? Who's getting this? Give me some yeses. Give me some energy. Let's exchange energy here. Let's be together, okay? Let's be together, okay? I want to make sure let's land these first principles. So now we have a separate self. Now we've got the separate self. It's the 19th century, but the separate self is a desiccated separate self. It's what's called by the poet Yeats, right, in The Wasteland. It's the hollow men and the stuffed men. Paralyzed, gesture without motion, right? Wow. Does everyone get that? Right? The best, right, are limp, right? And the worst are filled with passion and intensity. The best lack all conviction. The worst are full of passion and intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand, right? Writes the poet. Right? So we've got the separate self, which is this new emergent story of modernity, right? The dignity, but the dignity of the separate self has been undermined, denuded, right? We just have this desiccated separate self, this dangling modifier, right? In a sentence that's been erased, in a universe that's no longer a verse in this larger text. Does everyone get it? So now, stay close. Tom, this is for you now. So now, I'm going to jump into kind of the American, Western European, democracies right around the world. This new teaching begins to emerge, right? The old pre-modern teaching of the East, the teaching of enlightenment, begins to emerge again. There's a revivification, and Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda at the Great World's Fair, right, back in 1896, was part of this revivification. There's this reconnecting through a whole series of moves, right, of this true self tradition finds its way back into the Western world, right? And Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, right, writes a book called Perennial Philosophy, right, which is about this tradition of true self. And people like, right, let's say in the modern American context, my colleague and dear friend Ken Wilber picks up meditation along with dozens and dozens of other teachers, right? For example, one of Ken's original teachers, Rudy Rudrananda, was also the teacher of my dear friend Swami Chaitanananda, right? And right, there's this entire explosion. Muktananda teaches, right? Then you've got a wilder versions of it with other teachers, but you've got this explosion of true self all over the democratic world. Right? Everyone's exploding, and then it begins to move into places like Russia. It's all over the world, true self. And true self becomes, and it's not quite Indian philosophy, it's mysticism. And it's the mysticism of the East and the West. So it's Hasidism in the West, right? It's, right, dimensions of Steiner, right, in the West. And yes, as Sally absolutely correctly writes in the chat box, it's also Indian philosophy. So Indian philosophy is provocative, but it actually raises the entire deep mystical tradition, East and West, right, which is the true self tradition. Does everyone get that? Right? It's this true self tradition that's very strong, for example, in Hasidism. There's a book by Rivka Schatz called, in Hebrew, it's Hasidut Mystica. In English, it's, everyone should read it. It's Hasidism as Quietism. The first 3 chapters are about this true self tradition at the core of the Hasidic tradition. It's one of the major moves, okay? So read Steiner. It's very important in Steiner. It's very important in a lot of places. But as Sally correctly writes, it's the move of India towards the West actually provoked the West into reaccessing its own mystical traditions that it had put to the side. All of a sudden, Meister Eckhart becomes back in style, right? Who's a Christian mystic, but who's also a true self mystic. So true self mysticism begins to dominate the field. Does everyone get this? So enlightenment, this is my friend Tom, enlightenment becomes, now stay really close. So the first principle of enlightenment begins to dominate, right? People like Richard Alpert, young Jewish kid, right, from Boston, whose dad was the head of the local Jewish organization, right, changes his name to Ram Dass. Another guy named Jeffrey Miller, right, changes his name, right? And you got Surya Das and Ram Dass and Krishna Das, all Jewish boys, the Das brothers, right, who all went east, hung out either with Neem Karoli Baba or other of the, and then Jack Kornfeld and then Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein. There's a whole gang, and Danny Goleman, and there's a whole gang, right, who kind of write, and they're beautiful. And Ram Dass and I loved each other. And we spent, one incredible 9 days together. And then we met. He came to meet me in LA. And we spent this incredible day together. And I shared with him what I'm about to share with you. Okay? Right? This re-embrace of true self starts before the 60s. It gets popular. David asks in the chat box. It's popular in the 60s, but it starts actually at the turn of the century. The turn of the 20th century. That's where it starts. It really starts like 1900. Where it starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's rooted in theosophy also, Madame Blavatsky. Right? There's a number of the transcendentalists are very important. Wordsworth, right? That whole gang, right? Walt Whitman, super important. Right? There's multiple influences, and those influences, right, come together and they explode. Right? Alice Bailey Gurdjieff are part of that. That's absolutely right, Claire. Right? They explode. Right? This true self vision. Right, into the West. Does everyone get this? Everyone gets the frame? So I'm deep, my original lineage is Hasidism. Right, is the Hebrew lineage, Kabbalah wisdom. And in Hasidism, of course, there's a strong true self tradition. But as I'm studying the true self tradition in Hasidism, and as I'm kind of expanding and studying, the 3 wheels of Buddhism, right? Theravada and Mahayana and Vajrayana, and I was exposed to Kashmir Shaivism through a number of people, right, which is completely gorgeous, and to particular worlds, right, that Ken Wilber and I talked about, that Ken brought me into in beautiful ways, and then readings in philosophy all across the board, particularly Fichte and Schelling, in terms of their visions of true self. And so I'm kind of reading, and my body says no. Right? My body says, this is not enlightenment. This is beautiful. This is true, but it's limited. And I start talking to people about it. And I talk to kind of, colleagues who are, I won't mention the names, but are each one of them the leading names today in the kind of enlightenment world. And I just say, no, this is not quite right. Right? This is true, but it's not right. My body tells me it's not true. And so they say to me, that's your lack of realization. That's your ego hijacking it. You don't want to give up your ego. And the talk is about the impersonal. And my friend Andrew, right, talks about the impersonal, right? The impersonal, you got to move beyond separate self. Separate self is the personal. Everyone with me? Separate self is the personal. You got to move beyond, right, the personal to the impersonal. And my friend Andrew, who did all of his dialogues with Ken, calls his organization the Impersonal Enlightenment Fellowship, right? That's right. And he starts a magazine, What is Enlightenment? Or Enlighten Next, which becomes pretty much the center, right, of the enlightenment conversation in much of the United States and around the world. And it's all about true self. It's all about true self, or it's the creative expression of true self. True self is creative, which they called authentic self, but it's basically, it's impersonal. It's impersonal, okay? And let's go even clearer, like Andrew writes a book, right? In this book, right, Andrew uses the word personal about 47, 48 times, And each time he uses the word personal, it's a pejorative, it's a negative. But it's not just Andrew. It's not just my friend Andrew, who I love dearly. We just spoke on the phone a couple of days ago, right? Right? And he's gone through a complicated few years, and he's really emerged and taken a next step, and mad blessings to him, right? But it's not just, it's the entire system, right? Ken Wilber describes in all of his early books true self and views, right, that as the penultimate accomplishment, the penultimate realization. And just my body knew that's just not right. That's not right. And so I went deeper and deeper in, right, to the lineage, and deeper into my body, and deeper into what the personal is. And I prayed and screamed and fought and yelled and argued and practiced. And I began to realize and to formulate clearly, emergent from the lineages of Kabbalah, but also emergent from, enormous amount of the sciences, right? And how the sciences define reality, right? That actually we start with the personality, the personal of the personality. We get to the impersonal. This is how we get to first principles. We get to the impersonal, and the impersonal is true self. So we go from separate self to true self, right? You with me? So we got to leave behind that separate self that in the Renaissance became the center of everything, right? Actually, the great traditions weren't wrong, right? If I'm just the separate self of the Renaissance, right, the dignified individual, then actually that dignified individual, right, when you cut out spirit, becomes the hollow men and the stuffed men. So we got to go back and reclaim true self. That's absolutely true. But what the West did is the West went and reclaimed true self and left separate self behind. You get that? So the entire movement of enlightenment actually reclaimed true self, but left the separate self that the Western enlightenment had put forward behind. So I'm going to get there. I want you to get the words carefully. So the classical enlightenment traditions, mystical enlightenment traditions, East and West, left the separate self behind. But the separate self was the product of what we might call the Western Enlightenment, not the mystical traditions East and West. I'm calling those the Eastern Enlightenment, but it's really the mystical traditions East and West. But the Western Enlightenment, right, which starts in the Renaissance and goes to the Great Western Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment puts in the center the separate self and says, this is the dignity of the separate self. So when we reclaim true self in consciousness, in Western consciousness, we left that separate self behind. The separate self was supposed to die on the cushion. That's what the teachers taught. Pretty much across the board, every place. Right? The notion that the separate self had dignity was lost. Right? You got to be in the relative, you've got to use your relative, right, self, which is the term they used for separate self to navigate reality. But basically, the relative is just the relative. It's the absolute where it lives, and the absolute is true self. And I knew that wasn't true. I knew that was a mistake. And pretty much people laughed. One person who's a very well-known teacher today said, what Mark is doing is a desecration of the Dharma. And people were furious. I mean, furious. But you got to stay loyal to Shi. You got to stay loyal to realization. And gradually, I was able to articulate the following. First principles. And this is actually what enlightenment means. That actually we start with separate self. That's beautiful, right? The separate self of the Western Enlightenment is really important, because the separate self of the Western Enlightenment is about moving beyond suffering. Everyone with me? Who's with me? Who's with me here, okay? So let's stay really close here, okay? Let's stay really close, okay? We're not going to go that much longer, but let's get this first principle. We're about to land. The separate self of the Western Enlightenment, the separate self of the Western Enlightenment, is everyone getting this? The separate self of the Western Enlightenment, which is the dignity of the individual, which originally the Western Enlightenment just innately placed in a larger frame and a larger script of a universe, but later got desiccated when dualism, spirit and body, became only materialism. And so that separate self became a desiccated hollow men and stuffed men, right, of the poet. But originally, this original healthy separate self is actually important, because the separate self is about moving beyond suffering. But then we need true self, right? We were right about that. The movement of consciousness was right. We need to bring true self back, because true self is also about moving beyond suffering. You get that? And just stay really close. So the Western Enlightenment says, to move beyond suffering, you need to reify, right? You need to place at the center the dignified separate self human being. But the mystical Enlightenment, both East and West, but it's usually identified as Eastern Enlightenment, says, no, to move beyond suffering, you got to get rid of your separate self. You got to get rid of your separate self and only realize yourself as true self. Die on the cushion. Your separate self has to die on the cushion. So everyone see what happened? There's this huge contradiction. You've got mystical Eastern enlightenment, which expressions of it in both East and the West, which say to move beyond suffering, to heal yourself, and then to heal reality, your narrative of identity has to be true self. Separate self is an illusion. But then you have the Western enlightenment, the actual Western enlightenment, what's called in history Western enlightenment, at the Renaissance through the Industrial Revolution and the French Enlightenment. That's all called the Western Enlightenment, which says, no, you got to not define yourself in terms of larger contexts. You have independent, irreducible dignity. That's separate self, and only that will take you beyond suffering. So now we have two things that are called enlightenment: mystical Eastern enlightenment, as it appears East and West, and Western enlightenment, and they both completely oppose each other. That's where we were, and that's what kept me awake night and day. Because with that contradiction at the heart of culture, we don't have a shared first principle. We don't have a sense of identity, and I understood it's going to destroy culture. And so I prayed and practiced and began to realize the following. And that's what the Unique Self book's about, and that's what the book that Kirsten, maybe you can repost it, right? That's what the book that Kirsten just posted, which is called Self and Integral Evolutionary Mysticism, is about. Began to realize the following, and now we're about to get to a critical first principle that changes reality. And my colleague, who's been also my student and my friend, and now is co-president of the center, right? And Zach Stein, right, who's kind of, has taken this idea and taken it into education, right? And Kirsten's taken it into, world spirituality articles we've worked on together. And Claire is actually creating an entire institute around this, right? And it's at the core of, right, with Christina, our Outrageous Love and Eros project. Let's get what it's at the core of our festival. Let's get what it is. And this is the whole deal. Actually, we need to disambiguate, to separate, to distinguish between separateness and uniqueness. Okay? Right? Separateness and uniqueness. And Nathan, find Claire to talk about the Institute. Right? We need to distinguish between separateness and uniqueness. And by the way, for those of you who are listening to the recording, I often say a little asides because there's a conversation taking place with people in the chat box at the same time, which is the advantage of listening live. So I apologize for those asides. Okay, that's what those asides are. If you're listening, that's where they're coming from. Okay, so here's the distinction. We have to distinguish between separateness and uniqueness. See, both the Eastern mystical enlightenment and the Western enlightenment, right, the Western Industrial Revolution, French Renaissance enlightenment, both confused separateness and uniqueness. And that created this huge set of mistakes that can actually destroy culture. They're actually the source of our win-lose metrics with its extraction model and exponential growth and its self-terminating nature that will destroy us with existential risk. We actually have to distinguish between separateness and uniqueness. See, the Western Enlightenment, right, the individual of the Renaissance said, oh, you've got to be separate self. You got to be separate self. That's what you got to be. Because separate self is the source of dignity. And they got rid of true self. That's a mistake. That's not true. You actually can be not separate self. You can actually be unique self. And what's unique self? Unique self includes all of you. None of you is left out. It's not impersonal enlightenment. It's what we called back in 2003 or 2 personal enlightenment. All of me is included, and particularly my uniqueness is included. And my uniqueness is not my separateness. Now, I'm a unique self, meaning I'm not separate self. Like the Western Enlightenment got it wrong. It said we need to be a separate self to have dignity. No, I can actually realize I'm part of the field of true self. I'm one with the field. I'm one with the field of consciousness. And I can actually realize, as we added later, I'm one with the field of consciousness and eros and desire. But for now, I'm one with the field of consciousness. But that field of consciousness, that seamless code of the universe, is seamless, but it's not featureless. And I'm its unique feature. I'm a unique expression of the entire field. Or to put it in evolutionary terms, I'm a unique emergent of the entire field, right? So to be unique self means I'm not merely a desiccated separate self. I've actually reclaimed the field of true self, right? But not as a dogma, as the result of the best experiments in all the interior sciences that you can actually access directly. If you do the experiment yourself, you'll actually realize that you actually are consciousness beneath your personality. You can actually access that dimension of yourself in many ways. So I'm part of the field of true self, but I'm an irreducible, unique expression of that field. I'm unique self. So that's the correction of the mistake of Western enlightenment. But now we got to correct the mistake of, ready? Got to correct the mistake of what? You got to correct the mistake of what? You with us? Got to correct the mistake of Eastern enlightenment. How do we correct that? Eastern enlightenment said, right? You got to be true self, and therefore you got to give up separation. But Eastern enlightenment confused separation and uniqueness. So text after text after text, from popular Eastern enlightenment texts like the Course in Miracles, or particularly, people like Marion Williamson who were expressing the Course in Miracles, right? Or like, lots of texts in all over the American spiritual community, all conflated separateness and uniqueness, and many ancient texts conflated separateness and uniqueness. And I collected lots and lots of those texts, ancient and modern. That's a mistake. No, you've got to disambiguate. You've got to separate separateness and uniqueness. No, I'm not separate self. I'm true self, but true self doesn't obliterate my uniqueness. I'm a unique expression of true self. And actually, there is no true self any place in the manifest world. Every true self is a unique self. You get that? Wow. So now unique self becomes the core structure. That's a first principle. Then jump with me for a second. But then I realized, no, that unique self is in an evolutionary context. There's a larger evolutionary context at play. You with us? Who's with us? You got it? We're just about finished. Okay, we're in the stretch. You with us? Who's with us? Okay, there's a larger evolutionary context at play. I'm not just unique self. I am evolutionary unique self. Right? Actually, evolution is my first person. I am the first person of evolution. I realize I am evolution. I am uniquely evolution. I am the personal face of the evolutionary impulse beating in me, as me, and through me. Does everyone get that? So now we've added this evolutionary unique self, but that's not enough. That's not enough. Stay with us. But what's the interior experience of the evolutionary impulse? What's the interior experience of the field of consciousness? What does the field of consciousness feel like? And that's how we started today at the very, very beginning of our conversation, right? Not in part 2, which you're now in right now, but in part 1, when we said, the first sentence we said was, the universe feels, and the universe feels love. Not ordinary love, not love just between two separate self-human beings as expressed in the Renaissance, which then got devolved into a desiccated separate self of the hollow men and the stuffed men. Not ordinary love, which is a strategy of ego, right? Or a way to get status and security, which are all legitimate, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about outrageous love. And outrageous love, right? The eros that animates the cosmos. You begin to realize that field of consciousness of true self is not just a field of consciousness. That's a mistake. It's not just awareness. It's not just awareness of awareness. That's not going to take you home. It's not just awareness of awareness. Rupert Spira, love you madly, brother. It's not going to take you home, right? You actually have to realize that the interior quality of the field is eros, is outrageous love. It is ananda, right? And when I say I am evolution, I mean I'm a unique configuration of outrageous love. Outrageous love is the animating eros of the evolutionary impulse. I'm a unique configuration of that animating eros of the evolutionary impulse, which is moving towards, because now we've added evolution. Everyone get that? We've added evolution on the unique self. It's the next level, which is moving towards the evolution of intimacy, the evolution of love. Right? So I'm a unique expression of the evolutionary impulse that's moving towards the evolution of love. And as such, I realize outrageous love moves through me. And that's where Krista comes in, right? And Krista's holding this page that Dr. Christina Kincaid and I, right, kind of birthed together into the world in 2014, which is that who am I? I'm an outrageous lover, but that's not cute. That's Dharma. Right? That's a first principle. I'm a unique configuration of outrageous love. And as a unique configuration of outrageous love, right, I have outrageous acts of love to commit, right? And so Christina Kincaid, as we put up our new website for Many Paths, One Mountain, led a battle to make sure that we've got an outrageous act of love page on it so that we can actually all, every week, right, actually access that first principle. I'm a unique self. I'm a unique self in an evolutionary context. I'm the unique expression of true self. That's who I am, right? I'm the unique expression of true self, right? I'm the unique expression of true self in an evolutionary context. Means I'm evolutionary unique self. And as evolutionary unique self, who am I? I'm Homo Amor. And I called Barbara one evening and said, let's call it Homo Amor Universalis. Barbara used to talk about Homo Universalis, and I talked about Homo Amor, so we put it together for a time. I called Barbara right before church, let's call it Homo Amor Universalis. And then we agreed to kind of come back and call it just simply Homo Amor, meaning I am Amor, love, but we've ontologized love. So love is actually my core identity. And my core identity is love, right? But not ordinary love, right? Not romantic love, although romantic love might be an expression of outrageous love. But my core identity is the actual quality of outrageous love, which is personal. Now back to Renee and my brother Tom. Let's get this clearly. So level one is personality, separate self. Level two is the impersonal, right? The impersonal, true self. Level three is the personal beyond the impersonal, right? And together with, right, my dear colleague and gorgeous integral philosopher, Ken Wilber, Ken and I argued about this material and went back and forth in 2002 and 2003 and 2004. And ultimately, I then wrote a 1,500 pages about this lineage, right? Where this lineage comes from as an enlightenment lineage. And Ken beautifully read the whole 1,500 pages in a couple of nights and wrote me back, okay, I got it. I got it, man. I got it. He was in. He said, this is a critical new enlightenment lineage we got to integrate in the integral world. And I wrote the Unique Self book in 2009. But actually, back in 2004, 5, right, actually began to present this in the world. And Ken actually gathered, like 2005, this group of teachers. That's something that was then called the Integral Spiritual Center. And I was just delighted and honored. He asked me to present to this group, 60, 70, 80 teachers, present this new enlightenment lineage called Unique Self. And our colleague Genpo Roshi was there, and his students, and Dan Hamilton was there, it's fantastic, and Sally Kempton was there, and younger integral people there, Sean Hargens and Terry Patton were there, and Lama Surya Das was there, and just a whole host of people from the lineages around the world. And everyone's like, what is this? There was enormous, right, opposition to it in the one sense and recognition in the other. And Ken really kind of loved it, and it was gorgeous. And then everyone began to get on board, right? Roger Walsh was there, says Shahat. And then, just 2 years later, right? And I called it Unique Self. And Unique Self was a word that had already existed in a book I'd written called Soul Prints. But Ken and I talked about it, and we said, let's take that word. Ken said, let's take your Unique Self word and make that central. We did. And then a little short time later, right? Tara wrote a book that had a chapter on Unique Self. He was gracious enough to recognize how we sourced it, right? And Genpo Roshi wrote a book, and it had a chapter called Unique Self. This is now 2006, 7. And it's right about that time that, right, so we actually put into culture, we actually changed something together in the sort of consciousness, and the entire enlightenment community around the world, this began to spread. This began to spread. Andrew and I still argued about it. Andrew Cohen and I still have major, huge, public, knockdown, right, kind of debates on it. In the end, the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice in 2011, I edited a journal, right, all around this notion of unique self, which became a new chapter, right? A new chapter every place, everywhere, right? In an integral theory, but it's not limited. This is not an integral theory issue. Integral theory is gorgeous, but this is a unique self. It's unique self theory. It's part of a broader cosmoerotic humanism. It's unique self theory. There's an integral scaffolding. Integral is meant, as Ken set it up, as a scaffolding. Those of you who know integral theory, if you don't, bracket it, skip it. But it's very important for those of you. It's very, very important. I've sent a lot of people to integral theory. But unique self is the expression of this new emergent moment of consciousness. It's unique self, which is evolutionary unique self, which is Homo Amor. Okay, that's what we mean by Homo Amor. Homo Amor is the realization that I'm a unique expression of the love intelligence and love beauty. And now you begin to see how this comes together, right? In other words, unique self, evolutionary unique self, Homo Amor, becomes, right, the fulfillment of the whole story. Okay, and I'm just going to go 2 more steps and we're going to finish. So we really get this. We really get this. So actually, in the evolution of love, right, unique self is the next stage in the evolution of love. You actually get the storyline. You get that there's a narrative arc to cosmos, which is by itself a great realization. Science doesn't see a narrative arc. Well, science does. Scientism, the dogmas of science don't. There's a narrative arc. Cosmos moves from matter, right, to life, to mind, right? Matter, right? In what people call inanimate matter, but it's not inanimate. It's sentient. It's alive. right? It's not materialism and dualism. Matter itself is inherently creative. And then matter moves through all the stages, right? From the first nanoseconds of the Big Bang, from quarks, right? Subatomic particles to atoms, differentiate as atoms, differentiate into molecules, then into macromolecules that then intensify their intimacy and awaken as cells, and then to multicellular structures, and to organisms and organs, and all the way up, plants, fish, amphibians, right? Later, right? Early animals, later animals, right? Neural net, neural cord, up to hominids walking on the savannah. That's all life. So it's matter and the explosion of life. So matter is the physiosphere. That's the first Big Bang. Now stay close. Then the first Big Bang, right? Matter, the first Big Bang, right? The first Big Bang fulfills itself in life. So matter fulfills itself in life. The triumph of matter is life. Does everyone get that's a new sentence? That's a huge sentence. We've got to spend an entire 5 hours on this, but we're just going to do it in a minute. The triumph of matter is life. Matter triumphs and becomes life. Then life goes through all of its stages, which I just described cursorily in a second. And life goes through all of its stages until we get to hominids walking on the savannah. That's the biosphere. So the physiosphere, the first Big Bang, triumphs in the second Big Bang. And the second Big Bang is life, the biosphere. Then you go through all the levels of the biosphere. Then the biosphere of life triumphs in the human being, the hominids on the savannah. At some point, right, there's this explosion, this momentous third Big Bang, right? The noosphere, the mind, the self-reflective mind is born. Matter triumphs in life, right, triumphs in, everyone got this? Life triumphs in, right, mind, self-reflective mind, right? That is, stay close, right? That's the third Big Bang. Now stay really close now, this is the point. Then we go through all the stages in the gorgeous of the third Big Bang, through all the developmental stages of human history that we described in the beginning of this conversation. And then we get to a new set of first principles. We integrate pre-modern along all the wisdom streams, the pre-modern validated insights of all the wisdom streams, together with the modern validated insights of all the wisdom streams, together with the postmodern validated insights of all the wisdom streams. They come together, and there's a fourth Big Bang. And the fourth Big Bang is unique self. And as the triumph of the self-reflective human is Homo Amor. Now, if you don't faint in rapture and ecstasy at the beauty of the elegance, the gorgeousness, right, of what this human story is, this is the new universe story. This is the new Dharma. These are the new first principles. The new first principle is the fourth Big Bang. In other words, in the third Big Bang, we got as far as separate self. And separate self got us beyond, right, to birth the dignities of modernity, but separate self dissociated from true self. And then true self took the stage. So we just had this conflict between Eastern and Western enlightenment, right? Western enlightenment, separate self, dignity of the individual. Anything that effaces that is a cult, and let's get rid of those bad people. But actually, that's not true. Cults are pre-personal. There's actually a transpersonal option. There's a personal beyond the impersonal, and that actually is unique self. So unique self corrects the fracture in the misunderstanding of separate self. It says separate self actually has to emerge and reclaim its ground as true self. We're part of the field of consciousness, but that field of consciousness is not just consciousness, it's eros, it's outrageous love, it's desire. I'm part of the field of eros, outrageous love and desire, but I'm a unique expression of that field. And that's the fourth Big Bang. When I begin to actually experience myself, as a unique expression, not as a theory, but in my first person lived identity, I'm a unique configuration of that field, right? Then the third Big Bang has triumphed, right? Mind has triumphed into Homo Amor, right? That's the omega point. That's where we're going. That's a fourth Big Bang. That's what we've dedicated our lives to, because it's only the emergence of a new human and a new humanity that can actually generate, right, the response to existential risk into the second shock of existence. Does everyone get that? Right, and so then around 2007, this starts kind of 6, 7, starts seeping into the world, little pieces of it. But each one is a little piece, right? So some people will get the notion that, okay, that uniqueness is part of it, but they'll lose the evolutionary impulse. And other people will get the evolutionary piece, but lose uniqueness. And so in 2009, I actually wrote the Unique Self book to kind of get this straight, but now we got to issue a new version of the Unique Self book 10 years later to actually integrate all the pieces. right, as unique self-theory. But unique self-theory is not an abstract theory, it's the new story, right? I am Homo Amor. I am Homo Amor. I am the new human, and Homo Amor is not just an individual human being, it's a new humanity, right? And so Amor is outrageous love. And as Homo Amor, what do? Right? And that's what Lady Krista, who's our new lead executive producer, is holding the field of this, right? This outrageous love page within Many Paths, One Mountain. And we're going to launch ultimately, right, into an outrageous love project. Dr. Kincaid is directing and seeding this outrageous love project together with Stephanie and Ivan. And that's going to then be a sister of the Unique Self Institute, right? That's held by Claire and the festival, right? We're doing this huge festival, August. Shati maybe will put in the dates, this big Dharma festival. We're going deep into articulating new sets of first principles. That's actually coming up in August. But this is the revolution. We're part of this revolution, right? And so in this revolution, maybe we'll put in the link actually so people can actually see the link, right? We're part of this revolution, and this revolution is to actually, we are the revolution of the fourth Big Bang. Do you get that sentence? We are the revolution of the fourth Big Bang. That's us, right? And it's only the fourth Big Bang that can actually respond to existential risk. It's only the fourth Big Bang that can actually respond to artificial intelligence that obsoletes jobs and then obsoletes human identity as we know it. Without unique self, there's no game. Without unique self, there's no identity beyond my job. Without unique self, there's no reason why Thanos, right, shouldn't in the Avengers 2 movie wipe out, right, everybody and wipe out the future and just start it again, because there's no dignity to the irreducibly unique separate self. Right? Without the irreducibly unique separate self, there's all sorts of solutions to existential risk, which are tragic. But the irreducible dignity of the unique self, the irreducible dignity of the unique self, which is the separate self post true self. So the separate self, the ego self, is not wrong. It's not that you got to obliterate the ego. And it's not that you have to evolve beyond ego. There was all this talk about evolving beyond ego. Right? And the people that talk about evolving beyond ego are the most dangerous, because you can't call them on their ego because they deny it. Now, you never evolve beyond ego. You actually, your ego transmogrifies, transmutes into your unique self, right? Now, is there a danger of confusing unique self and ego? Of course there is, right? So you've got to point out the distinction. And in the unique self book, there's 25 distinctions between ego and unique self, right? Is there a danger of confusing true self-enlightenment with totalitarianism? Of course there is. But we don't dismiss true self-enlightenment. We have to distinguish, right? Unique self is individuation beyond ego. Unique self is higher individuation beyond ego. Does everyone get that? Unique self is higher individuation beyond ego, which I'm a unique self, and then I participate in the unique self symphony, which is why our vision, our goal is a planetary awakening in love through unique self symphonies. Let's see if we can just write that down for a second, right? Our vision is a planetary awakening in love through unique self symphonies. Right? Does everyone get this? We come together as unique expressions of the self-actualizing cosmos. We're unique expressions of the self-organizing universe, right? Each one of us is a unique expression of the self-organizing universe, the self-actualizing cosmos, and we each have outrageous acts of love to commit. And then that is what it means to awaken as Homo Amor. That in my consciousness, and with this we end, I'm going to turn to Lady Krista, right? In the consciousness of Homo Amor, there's only one question, right? Right? It's not quite the who am I of true self, which is Ramana Maharshi's question, where the answer is I am, meaning I am, right? I'm the impersonal I am. I'm impersonal consciousness. Well, that's part of the ground, but that's insufficient. True self's insufficient. No, it's not just who am I, right? It's who am I and what's there to do, or a deeper answer to who am I. So here we go. What's the deepest answer? What's Homo Amor's answer? Which has got to become part of my first person consciousness, and we democratize enlightenment. We democratize greatness. And the democratization of enlightenment, right? It's got to be a kind of democratization of enlightenment where every person realizes in their first person, I'm a unique configuration of evolutionary love. I'm a unique configuration of the evolutionary impulse. So we end here. So now all of a sudden, the sentence that we quote every week or two, right, with everything we've done now, we've reestablished this first principle, begins to make sense, right? So what do we have? Separate self. Separate self is a puzzle piece, but everyone thinks, right, in the Western Enlightenment, there's no puzzle. There's just the individuated I. That's all there is. Puzzle piece, there's no puzzle. Doesn't work. We then bring true self back. There's only a puzzle, right? That's when we bring true self back into consciousness and Western consciousness and into democratic world and all over the world. We bring it back and they say, no, no, no. There is no separate self. There's just one puzzle, but it's all one. But you say, what about the line separating the puzzle pieces? And your enlightenment teacher tells you that's just an illusion. It's just an illusion. So they're both crazy making. When you're looking for the puzzle as separate self, and your teacher tells you there is no larger puzzle, right? That's the modern teaching of Hobbes' law, right? Right? It's crazy making, right? That's why we have mental breakdown all over the world, because we're told a lie that violates our interior. But then you go to true self, or we're told another lie or partial truth, which is just, there's just one, there's just the one of the puzzle. The line separating the puzzle pieces, that's an illusion. Then we actually deepen, we realize the fourth Big Bang, evolution, right? Unique self. And unique self is, oh, right, there's a puzzle piece, right? And the puzzle piece completes the puzzle. Oh my God. So I'm held, Phil, you're a puzzle piece. I'm held by the larger puzzle and I complete the larger puzzle. And then I go to the last step, evolutionary unique self, and I'm a puzzle piece that evolves the whole puzzle, right? But that's me personally, right? My personal love story is part of the universal love story. I'm implicated in the evolutionary process. I'm personally implicated. But by personally, we don't mean the negative personal. We mean the personal beyond the impersonal. My story, my love story, is chapter and verse in the intimate universe, in the universal love story. It's a universe again. It's one eros and one love. And it's one heart again, but a one which is pluribus unum, right? It's the many that are the one, right? It's diversity and polarity, right? Together with unity at the same time, right? Right? It's individuation within union, right? The only mature individuation is in the context of the larger union. So now we end and we turn to Lady Krista. Here's the sentence, okay? Here's the sentence. Who are you? You are an irreducibly unique expression, right? Who are you? You are an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence and love beauty that is, right? That is the initiating and animating eros and energy of all that is, that lives in you, as you, and through you, that never was, is, or will be again in all eternity other than through you. And as such, you have an irreducibly unique perspective. As such, you have an irreducibly unique perspective. And as such, you're an irreducibly unique quality of intimacy. And your irreducibly unique perspective and your irreducibly unique quality of intimacy come together to foster your unique gift. And your unique gift is your very being. Your very beingness is your unique gift. And it's also the unique gift that you have a capacity to actually offer into. It's actually the activism, the unique activism that you have a capacity to offer into your unique circle of intimacy and influence, which means to actually access your deepest heart's desire, which is the field of desire uniquely expressed as you, and commit your outrageous acts of love. And your outrageous acts of love that are a function of your deepest heart's desire, which is the field of desire and consciousness uniquely expressed as you, that's actually you, the leading edge of evolution. You who manifested the whole thing, because where could you have been at the Big Bang other than right there? There was no place else to be. You started the whole thing. And our hands are linked in unique self-symphony. And each of us are committing outrageous acts of love. And each of us are standing together at the abyss of darkness and actually generating this fourth Big Bang, generating this unique self-symphony. Friends, it's that set of first principles that's going to take us beyond existential risk. It's that set of first principles that's going to take us beyond catastrophic risk. Right? It's that set of first principles that are going to actually heal suffering, right? Feed the hungry, right? Realize human potential, realize hope beyond imagination, realize beauty, goodness, and truth beyond imagination. Without those first principles, we'll fail. We'll fail. We'll fail. According to Toby Ord, right, over the next X amount of time, hundreds of years, he says we have he did all the deep mathematical work. He said we got a 1 in 2 chance of making it over the long term. Right? So let me tell you something. Without first principles, we got no chance. With first principles, we're going to take this all the way home and create a utopia on earth unlike that you can ever imagine. Because remember that first elementary particle at the moment of the Big Bang that took us from quarks to culture, lives in you and lives in me and lives in us together. That same generativity, that same creativity, that same love, that same eros that took us from bacteria to Bach, from mud to Mozart, from dirt to Shakespeare, right? That telos, that inherent telos of the ceaselessly creative cosmos lives in us. So just like that first elementary particle had within it the capacity to manifest all that's most gorgeous, true and good and beautiful, that elementary particle, all of them literally live in us. All of the interiors and exteriors live in us, exponentialized. So we are the face of the new divine, even as she holds us at the same time. Even as the field of God is beyond us, it lives through us. We are the leading edge, all of us together, right? And we together commit our outrageous acts of love. And we stand as, right, a planetary awakening in outrageous love through unique self symphonies.